I'm Kathy. Oops. Welcome, everybody. I'm Kathy Pettit. I'm at the Urban Institute and co-direct the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership with Leah Hendy, who's here. I was just explaining that I've been telling people all day how excited I am about this hour. And so I think we have some really practical information, and also that there's a lot of wisdom in the room too. So hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A and sharing at the end. I will first start to share these slides. Are you seeing it, Leah? Okay, excellent. Today's webinar is on communicating imperfect data responsibly. And then you can use imperfect, unreliable. I think Allison will just use wrong. So you can insert your adjective there about how you, depending on the data sources, but I think we've all run into data sources that fall short, and with our audiences want to lead them to the right way to figure out how to use this data, make sure that it's fit for the purpose that our communities are using it for. Just please mute yourself if you're not talking. It is set up as a meeting to be more of an exchange. Put questions in the chat as you go along, and the speakers can either glance at them or we'll pause after each speaker to give a couple chance for questions and hopefully have questions at the end. The session is being recorded, and we will send the slides and some other resources and links afterwards. So you don't have to worry about that piece. We do have a policy not to use Otter AI or other AI transcription tools in NNIP. So that has, if you attempted to add that in, that has not been, they were not accepted as attendees as background. We do have, we did have an invitation out to our, what I think of our cousin network, the Kids Count Network, which is a network of state level advocacy groups for the well-being of children and families, also funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, like we are. So for those of you who don't know NNIP, we are a network that helps communities use data to shape the strategies and plans and resources, so all neighborhoods are places where people can thrive. And we have a network of organizations in 31 cities, and they do the on-the-ground amazing work of really knowing the local context, knowing the people to reach out and provide the data that folks need to advance the local priorities. One of the goals of this was to have a moment to introduce the networks to each other and encourage, if you have contact with your corresponding NNIP/Kids Count partner in your geography. If you haven't talked to them in a while, to reach out to find out what they're doing, or if you need an introduction from us to get to know those folks, let us know too. We think we have a lot to learn from each other, both individually in your own states and as a network, since we have so much alignment on our both missions and philosophy and points of view. We're also actively supporting the development of new partners. We do have some possible new partners here today also. So if you're at a Kids Count and know of candidate organizations or think there should really be a group in Tulsa or whatever your city is, we always are happy to hear about leads and talk to people about the NNIP model. Today's presentation, when we get to it, we'll share sort of examples of evaluating, displaying individual indicators to communicate the data's uncertainty and limitations. We also believe, and this is part of our goals of using data for racial equity, about being transparent around bias and limitations of entire data sources themselves about how they were constructed and how they're collected, who's included. We couldn't cover all of that today. We'll send a couple of resource links on that aspect. In the follow-up note, this is a brief I wrote around focusing on young people, but has some general questions that are good for all topics. And Bob Graddick from Pittsburgh sent this great example, this responsible data sets in context website that I'll share with you too. So that's an important element of what we do, just not what we're going to be covering today. So we have two speakers today. I think we're going to flip the order. Allison's going first, but I'm very excited to have people who are so passionate about this topic and care so much about really presenting good, usable data to our communities. Before I get started, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to launch a little poll to see. I should have had an other or none, but anyway, I will launch this poll. I'm looking at this now, and all right. So I assume there's everyone's data people in this room, and this is why they registered. So if you want to click on some of it's check all that apply. What strategies have you used when faced with imperfect data? This could be the ACS or your local administrative data, any sorts of data at any level. What have your tool set been? As it's here, we'll wait for a second to get other people's in. And next time I will include some sort of other none, not applicable, but end the poll. All right. Yep, a bunch of explaining things in the text or just skipping it. It seems like the most common answers. So hopefully today we'll give you some creative ideas about how to include it, but with some visual cautions. That's there, and it is definitely, there's no one answer. It really depends on the data and the context and the use and the audience. So that's why we need really the expertise and context from all of you making these judgments as you go along. So I'm going to stop sharing. We wanted to just start with a warm-up question for the speakers before we jump into the slides. So just to ask Allison and Laura, we've had side conversations about this, but sort of how are you weighing factors when you're deciding whether and how to use perfect data, or which one of the strategies that we picked on? Allison, do you want to jump in?
Sure. And I'm really glad that Haley Tomlin, our senior data analyst, is with us today. She does a lot of this work, and thought she might have a couple things to add as well, but just quickly, obviously local knowledge is really critical, right? Like, that's if we were publishing this data for some other place, we wouldn't necessarily know that that it looks way wrong. And like if an indicator was very high last year and then we're updating it this year and it's suddenly very low, again, that local knowledge, we know it didn't change that much. So that would be a question. Haley, is there anything you would add of our protocols that are important for the group to know?
Yes. So we often display the margin of error with our estimates or do stat testing with our estimates to know if the margins of error sort of overlap and you're less certain about whether a estimate is different enough from a different estimate. But we do another type of statistical test called a coefficient of variation test, which I could send a link in the chat after I sort of mute
Send it to
myself.
me and we'll
Yeah, which is a measure of the variance like the sampling error of an estimate in comparison to the estimate itself. And that's a measure of how reliable the data is. So you don't have to be comparing one number to a different number. It's more about like when it was sampled, was there enough data measured for it to be the true number? So we use that sometimes to determine whether or not we should show an estimate.
Great. Yeah, I think that this is knowing where you are versus being a national, like just crunching anonymous places makes a big difference in how things go. Anything else, Allison, before I turn it over? Laura, do you have some initial thoughts?
Yeah, the very first thing I want to say is that this topic is an ongoing and dynamic conversation among our staff all the time, every month. It seems like for the entire 15 years that I've had this job. So we have some general rules. We also have some case by cases. I'll talk about a little bit of mix of that. I would say my one hard and fast rule is to go into everything trusting that all data is imperfect. And our job is to figure out how and how severe the imperfections are. And it might not necessarily be the entire data set. It might be some parts of it. And then what the implications of that are. And I think a really easy example is that, with American Community Survey, we just really should be using percentages and not the numerical estimates, right? So that doesn't mean that all of American Community Survey is junk, but we shouldn't be, to the extent that we can, using numbers of people who are housing cost burden, for example. And I think it really depends on the purpose that we need the data for. We know the data is wrong because it's an undercount, but if what somebody really cares about is a trend, and as long as it's the same kind of wrong every single year, then we can still trust the trend, right? But I think our general rules are, is there an alternative to that data source that's as good or better? I think sometimes with specific issues or some marginalized populations that aren't well represented in some of our national data sets, then we'll use some convenience sample survey data that someone collected and just be real clear about it. And are the imperfections something that we feel like we can manage or mitigate? And then if we put the data out there, what are the implications? Is there going to be real harm, especially to somebody or communities that have been harmed before? So I guess those are our overarching rules.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think both, the harm and the implications are definitely important. So I think for the next couple of sections, Allison's going to give a couple of concrete examples. We'll break for a question or two, and then we'll move to Laura's examples from the San Antonio case, and then see if we have time for questions or comments at the end. I do expect this will be like Laura said, an ongoing conversation and exchange of examples way past this 1 hour we have together. So Allison, I think you should be able to share your slides.
Oh, I'm sorry. I sent them to you
Or
all. I thought you all were sharing them, but I'm happy
I can
to.
get it.
Okay. If you have it, otherwise I will pull it up.
I also have them right here.
Are you doing it, Kathy, or do you want me to?
I was downloading it, and then it was slow to open, but
I can do this. Let's see. Challenge. All right, we can get that squared away at first.
let me download the local copy. It was going from Box, and Box decided to be difficult. All right, I'm here. Thanks, everybody, for your technical patience. All right, we're here.
Awesome. Thanks. Okay, thanks. And yeah, my apologies about that. So yeah, if you want to just go to the next slide, I'm going to show you 3 examples of how we show imperfect data. The first comes from our neighborhood profiles. And you all know, that census tract ACS data has high margins of error. We combine them to make neighborhoods, and then that actually increases the margin of error. So on the next slide, you can see that when we list the ACS data, we actually put the data of the margin error alongside the data point right there. And then if you click to the next slide, you can see that, if someone were actually on our website, they could click on that MOE and it would pop up this little screen. And this is just-in-time learning. And so our experience is that, providing answers to questions folks have like right when they're working with the data is really the best way to provide an effective learning experience. So we developed this kind of pop-up window to give a sense of how to write about this. If we go to the next slide, you can see we even give, one back, just there you go. I just point to a sentence. So we even give you like, hey, you can write about this data this way. From 2016 to 2020, somewhere between 59.1% and 59.9% of people commuted less than 30 minutes to work. So that's how one could interpret some of the data. So then the next slide is a little widget that we provided. We know that people want to compare their neighborhood to the city or the US, but the margin of error makes that difficult. So to help them, we created this widget, and it can take any 2 data points and the margins of error to determine if they're statistically different. And so the next slide shows an example where we literally input the values on occupied housing in a particular house neighborhood compared to Orleans Parish, which is the whole city of New Orleans, and found out that yes, there's a statistical difference, which is not obvious unless you actually do the calculation. And we user tested these pages with community members before releasing them. And in those user tests, we found that, sometimes folks were struggling with the design. And so then we made changes. For example, we changed the instructional language on how to use the widget to make it more user-friendly. And then we went back and user tested it again and verified that change really worked. We also found in our user tests that users had a profound sense of accomplishment when they understood what these margins of error were and used the widget in order to calculate the statistical difference. So this was a really fun thing to put together. And then on the next slide, this is my second of 3 examples. There's a lot of demand. We had a lot of demand for mapping ACS data. We got that from questions through our website and also meetings we attended, but figuring out how to spatially display small area data with large margins of error is even more difficult than just putting it in tables. So the next slide shows you a little bit about some of why this is weird, right? So this is ACS data at the block group, just the raw ACS poverty rate. And it looks as though it's very precise, right? Certain block groups have high poverty, others don't, and the ones that are really close by, right? But we looked at this and we know that this is not how our city looks. That it's not this precise in terms of different block groups. So it didn't ground truth well. So on the next slide, we started looking at those margins of error. And we knew that if you looked at all these values at their highest margin of error or at their lowest margin of error, you get a very different picture. So we created a little slide bar so people could do that. And on the next slide, you can see what that looks like. So the lowest margin of error would look like almost nobody's living in poverty in New Orleans. And then the highest margin of error would look like almost everybody's living in poverty in New Orleans. So obviously the margin of error has a big influence on the accuracy of this data. Um, so we did, you can go to the next slide. We started looking at a way to work with the data to make it look more true. And we did several things, and I'll show you how to get to this methodology. But basically, we averaged together block groups that are next to each other, that neighbor each other, and remove neighbors like that, not really neighbors because there's water in between, like the Mississippi River or the Industrial Canal. And the resulting map is this one, and it produces a much clearer and more logical picture of the patterns of poverty. And then we looked at this map and compared it to other indicators, say from the LEHD data or administrative data that were available that showed, yes, we see these similar sorts of patterns in terms of communities that have lower wages or other issues. So this result we felt really good about. If you go to the next slide, we wrote in detail the methodology. So you can download that and replicate it without much difficulty. And so that's our second example. And then our third example is something more recent. We published a number of data points in a dashboard about youth in New Orleans. And there were a couple of them that really looked wrong to us. And so I'm just going to show you those two that looked very wrong. If you hit the next slide. So this was the percent of children with no computer or internet subscription at home suddenly had a really low value when the previous year it was a much higher value. It would be very, very strange if suddenly in New Orleans there were very few children that did not have internet at home. And so we put that kind of caution sign on there. And if you mouse over at the next slide, I'll show you what that looks like. We have a nice big caution that says, we recommend caution with using this data point. We explain in very lay terms that, ACS data are really becoming less reliable because response rates have fallen so much. And we point out that last year, this same indicator said that 9% of children in New Orleans had no internet subscription, which is much more logical. So we felt it was important to just show the data, but we wanted to give this really strong caution as well. And then if you go one more, we'll show our other example from this dashboard. And this had to do with the percent of young people without a high school diploma, suddenly lower than the state and national average. Definitely didn't make any sense. So we put that caution sign on there. And then if you mouse over it, you see a very similar caution. Response rates have fallen. And the ACS found last year that there were 16% of young adults who lacked a high school diploma. So we felt that these kind of cautions were really important for people who are writing grants or using the data in any possible way. So those are the three examples we want to share today.
Thanks, Allison. Do folks have any questions, or I saw there's already been a couple just admiration things in the chat. Me too. That's why I've been so excited about this.
And a huge thanks to Lamar for jumping in and answering the technical questions, which I don't have a grasp on.
I'll just ask a quick question about. We have a lot of questions.
I assume you discussed whether or not to display the data at all versus your warning label, and how did you land on the warning label?
Yeah, Lamar, I don't know if you can come off of mute. That was a conversation that Lamar and I had. Lamar felt it was important to show the data.
Sure. So if you take a look at some of our other products on our website, like neighborhood profiles, there are tons of time where we err on the side of showing the data, but just providing enough context. Allison showed it earlier, right? That's where the stat testing tool was. But just provide enough insight and context so that users can make their own decision. It's better than leaving a vacuum of information, right? Which invites all kinds of other speculation and things like that. So on the youth dashboard, it was sort of the same idea, right? That this is data that people have been asking for years and years and years in our community. If we did not provide it, then it was going to come from somewhere else, or they were going to use uh, maybe opinions or other anecdotes and things like that to fill in the gaps. So we thought it important to show the data. It didn't mean all of it was wrong, right? But the particular data point that we thought was problematic, just put a caution sign next to it so folks can know, everything else is good, but this you may want to take with a little bit of caution. So
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Well, if you have other questions, and we'll come back, I have some other follow-up questions after we do the slides, if there's time. Um, Laura, do you want to share your slides, or was I supposed to? I realized that now it wasn't which way it was supposed to go.
I got it. Okay, so I want to preface this by saying that on a Friday night, Friday evening, Kathy sent out a call and I didn't see the full subject line. And I think I got emotionally hooked before I saw the full. It was strategies for coping with uncertainty. And I was just like this into my inbox, like, oh, yes, let's talk about strategies for coping with uncertainty. Oh, in the data. But we spend so much time on this. We've spent so much time on this for so long that it felt like a place where it would be valuable to pull together, if only for our own thinking, all the strategies that we currently use or have used in the past at CI now. And so again, this is the product of a lot of different staff work and conversations. And I think I might be the Mar in our office, that I generally tend to say, we need to put it out there, if for no other reason than to point out the fact that there is inequity in the quality of the data, right? So, and then we've had other people that have argued so much for suppression that it was just like, why don't we just all pack up and go home? We don't need to look at that intermediate here. So we have a document that has examples for all of these strategies, and I'm happy to share because I am a nerd and did it on a Friday night. But I'm just going to talk about these three here today. And this is, I would say that the way that we handle things might differ depending on whether we're talking to people about the data, or it's in a PDF report, or it's in an interactive online visualization. I feel like our ability to talk with people about it differs depending on the vehicle, right? So this is our Bear Data Dive tool, and I have to take a moment out to shout out to Brian Herron, the Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University. He is the developer that worked very closely with Jeremy on our team, Jeremy Pine, based on our user-centered design that Data Driven Detroit taught us how to do, and built this amazing tool that I can't believe that we have done it. So we offer users the choice to look at margins of error. You're going to see them no matter what. You don't get a choice, but you can see it either as numbers, the estimate with the minimum and maximum as numbers, or you can see these error bands. And we first started using these in print reports, and they seem to work pretty well because you can see how different the uncertainty is for different race, ethnicity groups, how different the margin of error is. And you can also see really easily where they overlap and where we can and can't be sure there's really any difference in between groups. And then these are charts from print reports, and you can see that they look visually the same. Again, we figured out how to do this in print reports before we built Dive. And all of our charts are images that are generated using our code, and we're always happy to share our code. If we didn't have we wouldn't have nearly as much power to annotate charts the way that we do and fuss around with formatting so much. So if you haven't, there's a learning curve with R for sure. But we're happy to help if you think you might be interested in adopting it. So, here's an example of a chart where we've got two error bands, and you can see that South Bexar County used to be very different from the county overall. And now not only are the estimates moving closer, but those margins of error overlap. In bar charts, we show error bars as a gray line, and we tend not to show the min-max on bar charts because it just gets so busy. Same for trend charts, actually. You have to try to guess where the top and bottom of those bands are. But we do like that it's an easy way. People can kind of take their literal or metaphorical ruler and put it down the middle and see which of those error bars overlap. And also that, chronically, we're going to see much narrower bars with our total population and with our Hispanic than we are for any other group. So we used a population pyramid style chart for this, just two back-to-back bar charts. But the reason I wanted to show you this one is because it's an example of flagging margins of error that we decided were too large relative to estimate. And we don't tell people until like the technical notes in the back what too large is. But we use the coefficient of variation that Haley was talking about earlier and that she dropped in the chat. And we tend to follow the rules that the data source uses, just like we do with cell suppression. Do you want us to suppress at 5, at 10? Cases. So for ACS, we're flagging at a coefficient of variation of greater than 0.4. So I'm looking at notes. And with BRFIS, the behavioral risk factor surveillance system, greater than equal to 0.3 for the relative standard error. So not necessarily the same threshold in play for every data set, but we do have it every time we use a BRFIS indicator, every time we use an ACS indicator, we flag at that threshold. And back in 2016, when we were a little more uptight than we are now, we decided that we didn't. Also, our community has come a long way, honestly. In the past 10 years, the data literacy in this community is much higher than it used to be. But at one point, we decided that it wasn't safe to provide estimates when the margin of error was so large, or the standard error, I guess, because this is BRFIS, and that we would just provide the confidence interval, the min-max, and not provide the estimate at all. So you can still see the bars and where they are relative to each other for these different sectors of the county, but you don't get the estimate for all of them. And you can see that the MOE, or the error, is still relatively wide, even for the ones that we did show. The sectors themselves are a strategy that we used because BRFIS data, our sample size was far too small for the estimates to hold water at the zip code level. So these are clusters of zip codes that we used to allow us to try to make some kind of guess at the sub-county level with BRFIS. And I was going to mention too, we feel like this is especially helpful when the estimate is not at the midpoint of the interval, which is not the case with ACS, but it is with BRFIS sometimes. And then I just wanted to credit those staff I've talked about, that if they're in orange, they're currently on the team, and others have gone on. And then again, Brian Heron and Jeff Waltman have been so helpful in on the tech side, on the contractor side. And that's all I have.
You're muted, Kathy.
Great. I was just flagging there's definitely eagerness to code share and admiration in the chat that's there. If people have other questions or comments or examples that you want to share from your own work about how you've handled things, please put a note in the chat, and we might, if it's more elaborate, we can pull you off of mute to share by voice. But I just wanted to have a couple of follow-up questions for Allison and Laura in the meantime. Just how have you, either through formal user testing, like Allison mentioned, or just informally, what's the reaction to like, no, but I want the number, like, or to not to making that uncertainty more explicit than just accepting the data at face value, which is certainly easier or less mental space, maybe. But have you either, yeah, like I said, either formal or informal reactions to your thoughtful use presentation of the data?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it depends on the user or the audience, right? I was just yesterday morning, I was doing or maybe this morning, I was doing a media interview with local radio, and the population, if anybody's paying attention to the population estimates that came out at the end of last year, the Census Bureau for the first time incorporated a lot of data, administrative records on immigrants, international immigrants. It really changed the estimates a lot, but the way they distributed them to each state was a method that they're going to revise, and it's probably not very accurate. And so I was explaining that, and even explaining that 1 year does not make a trend, and an estimate is an estimate. And yeah, the radio guy was like, "Oh, so it's just an estimate." I was like, "Right," and it could change, right? But I think it's a lot harder for people who are making like decisions, like about where to invest money or what kind of policies to adopt.
How many schools to build?
Yeah, then exactly. That's where it's harder, where they want, some more certainty. And I mean, I think, what you can do is things that we always talk about at NNIP, like look at various data sets to see if you can triangulate, to just get at least more confidence that like that's probably pretty close to accurate. So I think that it really depends on the audience.
I think it's fair to say that the umbrella answer for us is that we annoy people and we don't care. That in our write-up where there's
tagline.
there's 13 different Burfus indicators in a report, every single paragraph, every single chart, the discussion of it is going to say, as elsewhere in this report, we cannot distinguish between race ethnicity groups or sectors or whatever, because the margin of error is too wide. And then we'll say, if you want a narrower margin of error, then let's get the state to enlarge our sample size. And in fact, our local health department has made that investment to get us a larger sample size. So this is the first year that we might be able to actually see data at the zip code level, show it responsibly. I know. But and then sometimes we just there are cases where we just refuse to use something that someone else wants us to use, and we ran into that with our State of the African American Community report. There was a third party, not our funder, not our client, not us, that wanted us to use the Paycheck Protection Plan program data. Sorry, I put an extra P in there because there's so little about access to capital for people of color, for the African American population locally. There is nationally, but only 10% of Bexar County's records, I don't know what it was like elsewhere, had race ethnicity in the data set. And we felt like if 10% were missing, we could work with that. 10% present, just that's worse than nothing, right? And we won't do it. So we actually wrote into the report, we would have used PPP data, except that it does not have race ethnicity in 90% of the records.
And there's a question in the chat from Jenna about just your advice if the agencies are making decisions to suppress the data. So they're basically taking the decision, they have fewer options than you guys have presented here about the cautions and visualization, and someone made that decision for them. So do you have advice about which the agency?
I'll jump on that one and then be quiet since I'm already talking.
Keep going.
Two things you will see in any of those reports that I've mentioned, in the document that you haven't seen, sorry. You'll see where we have a note in the chart that a value was suppressed for privacy or whatever. Sometimes it's the source suppressing it, sometimes it's us. But there'll always be a note about why that value is missing. The other thing that we've done is work with our partners at the local health department and at the state. And I know that we're so lucky. This isn't the normal scenario, but given them either our sub-county sectors in the Burfus scenario or the statistical small areas that we created out of census tracts for things like vital stats that we get from our local health department, they have that code and they aggregate up for us. If they gave it to us at the census tract level, then it would all be suppressed. But if they aggregate up on their end in ways that are beneficial to us, roll up a couple of race ethnicity groups or roll up to that SSA level, for example, then we have much less suppression. So maybe work with them if you can. Most of them are using code to query the data anyway. And especially if you could throw a little money their way, maybe to help cover that cost, then they would be willing to do that for you.
Or show these good examples, how you could do it responsibly. Allison?
Yeah, I think that's right on. And I think I would just add, I have a lot of interactions with the Census Bureau with the work that I do now. And what I can tell you is that they hear very little from end users other than researchers. And so, it's really hard for them to know how people are using census data and where, suppressed values or anything is a problem and for what uses. They really only know mostly from other researchers, which is not really the primary intent of census data. So yeah, I think it's great, not that it'll be a magic bullet, that they'll just give you the data, but for them to hear more and more and more. And I think, going forward, we all really need to speak out about the data that we want and be prepared to do that. And be public about that. And that'll be really important for all the federal statistical agencies in the near future.
I could ask a question. How do you communicate when you think the data is wrong versus unreliable? Based on your triangulation.
I have an answer. Allison, you want to go?
Go ahead, Laura, you go ahead.
Okay. I think it depends on why the data is wrong. And the example that I'd give is in Bexar County, we always trended the rate of confirmed victims of child abuse and neglect per 1,000 kids. And it started plummeting, but we had no reason to believe, like Allison was saying earlier, we had no reason to believe that that was actually happening. So we dug into the data and started looking at all the stats that were available about the pipeline of investigation and the workflow, and saw that the number of reports hadn't gone down, but the percentage of reports that were assigned for investigation had gone down, and the percentage of investigations that had been completed had gone down. And if you don't have a complete investigation, you can't either confirm or rule out abuse and neglect. So the folks that look at this data regularly in the county started saying, we've got to look at reports and the confirmed victims rate. And we write about it in the narrative every single time. And now with COVID, we saw the rate drop again because kids weren't in school in person. And those are some of the most frequent reporters, are school personnel. So just telling people this is not real. But we do tend to report the data and then talk about it rather than just not use it at all. And if it's wrong because somebody has an agenda or it's bad, then we will, you know what I mean? That's a different scenario.
Allison, do you have some wrong data advice?
Well, like I said, the examples from the youth dashboard we pointed to, look obviously wrong. And then, it's harder to tell with some of those neighborhood values, whether, the poverty rates are too high or too low, and, the margins of error are what we provide so people can, make their own calculations.
Yeah, I think I restricted the number of examples they could share given the time, but I think the idea of having local data or other related data or somehow showing trends in other places, in other sources is another way to handle it. So I think what you're saying though is denying people the data. In general, you think denying people the data is generally worse than showing the bad data and explaining.
I think that's
Oh,
fair.
okay.
Yes. Yes. And then, you know, if it's a data point that looks like it's going to be consequential. Some years ago, we were publishing a report that included the percent of all working age Black men who had employment in New Orleans, and it was only 48%. It was less than 50% of all working age Black men had employment, and I thought, oof, that's going to cause a reaction. And so I said, let's check other sources, right? So that came from the census, but then from ACS, but then BLS had data that was very similar. And I think we were able to find something else as well. So just like everything was kind of in that range. It wasn't like some other, it wasn't like BLS said 75%, right? So we felt confident that that was the right value. And the good news is that it did cause a stir, and the city created a whole department to address and increase employment among Black men. So that was a good thing, but you want to make sure that your data, is correct, right? When you're going to send out something like that.
And I see Jenny came off mute. I think she has a question.
Yes, thank you. Well, you mentioned child welfare data, and I recently have been working with some of our local child welfare data, which I find can be very, very messy. And one variable, which, looking at it, and I was looking at it in reference to foster care youth and children that were getting placed, and it was inconsistent. Some of the data was inconsistent. About 25% of it was, and I found that really just that size. It's like it's like when you said 10% missing, it's not so bad, but and so I just was kind of curious, like. I know it kind of depends on the data, but when you find it's not just missing, it's just like it appeared inaccurate. How do you address that? And like when does, at what size does it seem to be a concern?
How about you, Allison? We don't have a hard and fast rule.
Yeah.
Sometimes data sets just smell bad. You know what I mean? Like you're like, there's something up here, and we don't, we don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's where local knowledge comes in, right? It just would be impossible for somebody who's not local to sense when these things are off. I think of my colleagues at the Census Bureau who work on population estimates, and they make all kinds of estimates, right? And they're adjusting and whatnot, and they have no idea what, they can't really assess it relative to local conditions. So they have some standards for demographic reasonableness, but still, it's that local knowledge is so critical for really identifying whether a data point might be way off.
And it sounds like, I think that speaking, I think there's some Charlotte folks in the room. They shared some of their metadata links, sort of deep knowledge from the agency, really the data, how the data is collected, from whom, and having those sort of deep conversations with the folks closest to the data, and maybe even some of the we have a great example that we can find from the Cleveland example of interviewing some of the frontline people who were collecting the data on HMIS, sort of doing, if it's an area that you care deeply about, which I'm guessing it is, to do that extra qualitative research when you have the time to understand more. And I think in the best cases, if I remember the HMIS example, right, which I'll include on the follow-up note, but, you know, to actually think about how to improve data on the front end too. Like if people understand why the missing data matters or why it's, you know, need to be careful about things, but the is another path that I know Kids Count folks have regular relationships with agencies like our partners do too.
I have an opportunity a few times a year to speak to graduate students who are in a community health needs assessment class. And one of the things that, first of all, they've never heard of administrative data until you tell them what it is. And then they, okay. Telling them that it's critical that they get to know the data set before they use it. And I give a couple of funny examples, like when I was working for a federally qualified health center and had to generate the top 10 diagnoses, and the top diagnosis in every group was finger injury, not otherwise specified. And it turned out that that particular software program didn't have a way to have a null value. It just defaulted to finger injury. So if you queried out to 15 diagnoses, you were going to pick up a lot of finger injuries. Yeah, so that, and you know, in claims data, that if they're going to code what the insurance company will pay on, not so you're going to get depression instead of PTSD in the data. And just being, there was one school district we worked with, that a lower income school district that heads us up, that once the pregnancy flag is toggled on for a high school student, female student, that it's never toggled back off again. So she never becomes unpregnant. And so to watch out for that. And if we tried to compare across, you know, our 17 school districts pregnancy rates, that would have been a disaster. So it really is incumbent on us, in my opinion, to earn the trust of the people that are providing data to us, by asking those questions, writing them down in our metadata and caring about them, and maybe letting them read the write-up at the end and say, did we represent this accurately?
No magical answer, Jenny. I'm sorry.
I figured as much. Yeah, and it's just interesting to hear because I did ask a lot of questions and I went to different sources. So yeah, but yeah, just good to hear what other thoughts are on how to approach it. So thank you.
Any last questions before we are coming close to the end of time?
I'd love to hear if anybody else has a strategy we haven't mentioned here. Is there something somebody else does out there?
Yeah, or if you have good visualization examples, either from your own organization or things that you really like, that you've seen, we'd love to start collecting those too. So I'll just
my only tiny tip is I generally round to the nearest whole number for ACS data because I feel like the decimal points provide a layer of precision that or communicate precision where there is none.
Good tip. All right. Well, we will close out for today. Thanks, everybody, for joining and seeing these fantastic examples. We'll be sending a follow-up note with the recording and the materials for anybody who registered. I know there's many more people who couldn't make it today. I would say for the Kids Count folks, there's a link to our newsletter. We have a quarterly newsletter from NNIP, and our email too, if you want to share examples or questions or other ideas about how our networks could connect and learn from each other. That would be wonderful also. And otherwise, I'll wish everybody a good afternoon, and we'll be in touch. I know everyone will continue to do their best to be thoughtful providers of data to the people we care about.
Thank you.